On the cold morning of October 2, 1552, the 14-year old King Edward VIII, the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, awoke in the royal apartments at Hampton Court with a tightness in his chest he could no longer hide. At first it was dismissed as a seasonal chill, the sort of cough any Tudor subject would have ignored. But this was no ordinary boy. This was the future of the Tudor dynasty, its only male heir, and every breath he struggled to take carried the weight of England's destiny. No one knew it yet, but Edward's illness would unravel into one of the most horrifying royal deaths in European history, a slow collapse of body and soul that even contemporary observers refused to describe in detail. The truth, buried behind softened chronicles and carefully edited state documents, is far darker than most people realize. To understand why Edward's death was such a catastrophe, one must return to his birth October 12, 1537 the day Henry VIII finally believed God had smiled upon him. After divorcing one queen, executing another, and appending his entire kingdom's religious identity, he had obtained what he wanted above all else, a son. But Edward did not come into the world with the strength of a future warrior king. Contemporary midwives noted his frailty, the unusual quietness with which he cried, and the way his tiny chest rose unevenly. Even Queen Jane Seymour, exhausted and bleeding internally, sensed something ominous. She smiled with pride but whispered weakly that the boy must be protected. She would die 12 days later, leaving Edward motherless and physically vulnerable from the start. Henry VIII, aging, obese, and increasingly paranoid, poured every ounce of hope into the child. Edward was placed under strict supervision, given the best tutors, physicians, and spiritual advisers England could assemble. But despite this royal attention, the young prince remained thin, pale, and fragile. Records from the royal household reveal repeated bouts of fever, unexplained fatigue, and concerning respiratory difficulty. His tutors wrote of a brilliant mind housed in a body that struggled to keep pace. Even as a child, Edward rarely engaged in the rough play typical of Tudor boys. Running left him breathless, cold weather weakened him for days. His education therefore became his identity, sharp intellect compensating for a failing body. The political world around him was just as fragile. England had broken from Rome, monastic lands were dissolved, religious conflicts simmered, and powerful nobles circled like hawks, waiting for Henry's death. They all knew the truth. If Edward did not survive to adulthood, the entire Tudor experiment would collapse. Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, remained a devoted Catholic. Elizabeth, though brilliant, was considered illegitimate by many. Only a male heir like Edward could hold the religious and political factions together. So when Henry VIII finally died on January 28, 1547 the 9-year, old Edward became king, not because he was ready, but because the dynasty had no other choice. The boy king was placed under the care of his uncle Edward Seymour, who declared himself Lord Protector. But power struggles erupted instantly. Ambitious nobles saw a sickly child and assumed they would rule behind him for decades. Edward's health, however, was already betraying him. Court observers described his hands trembling during council meetings, his difficulty standing for long ceremonies, and his increasing dependence on warm, enclosed rooms to keep chills away. But for several years the public saw only the image carefully crafted for them, a scholarly, promising young king destined to restore England's greatness. By the winter of 1552, that image cracked. The first sign was a persistent cough, recorded in the journals of court physician John Caius. At first it seemed mild, but within weeks the boy began coughing so violently that blood stained his sleeves. The palace staff noted he could not climb the stairs without stopping to catch his breath. The once bright eyes of the Tudor heir grew dim, sunken, and surrounded by a bluish pallor, but the darkest detail came from those few allowed inside his private chambers. As Edward's illness worsened, he began losing weight at a terrifying speed. His bones protruded sharply beneath his skin, giving him the appearance of a living skeleton. His hair thinned, his nails turned brittle, and even his voice, once described as soft but clear, became nearly a whisper, strained and rasping. The disease attacking Edward was more than simple tuberculosis, as history textbooks often claim. Tuberculosis alone cannot explain the drastic systemic decline later described by the handful of attendants who left private accounts. Whatever consumed him did so with horrifying speed and aggression, attacking not only his lungs, but also his muscles, bones, and skin. By ***, February 1005, 153, ***, the royal bedchamber was filled with the metallic smell of sickness. Edward struggled to breathe even when propped upright by pillows. The windows were shuttered to keep the winter air out, yet the cold still penetrated his weakening body. Multiple physicians visited him daily, each prescribing bloodletting, herbal mixtures, and heated plasters, treatments that only worsened his condition. Political panic grew. A dying king meant chaos, civil war, and possibly the destruction of the Protestant reforms Edward had championed. Mary, a Catholic, stood next in line. Those who had shaped Edward's reign feared imprisonment or execution if she gained the throne. Thus, behind the scenes, a terrifying scheme took shape. Keep Edward alive long enough to secure a Protestant successor, even if it meant hiding the true extent of his suffering. Edward himself understood what was happening. Despite being only 15, he wrote in his private journal that his illness was waning my body with great violence. But he never wrote the full description. Perhaps he was too weak, or perhaps the truth was simply too horrifying to record. Eyewitnesses, however, revealed what he endured. His coughing fits lasted minutes, shaking his entire frame. His ribs cracked under the strain. At night, attendants could hear wheezing echo through the chambers, as though the boy were drowning in his own lungs. His skin turned grey, then nearly translucent, revealing the faint blue of veins beneath. Even touching him caused pain. Yet worst of all were the lesions that began appearing across his body, raw, open wounds that Tudor chroniclers avoided describing directly. Modern historians theorize that Edward suffered from a rare co-infection, tuberculosis combined with a severe immune disorder or viral attack, possibly measles or smallpox complications. Under such conditions, the body breaks down from the inside, slowly liquefying tissues and weakening organs. By the end of March, the young king could barely speak. When he did, his attendants recorded that his breath smelled of decay. Edward VIII, the hope of the Tudor dynasty, was being consumed alive, and yet the world still did not know the truth. Because the real horror was only beginning, by the early days of April 1553, the private halls of Whitehall had turned into something resembling a silent battlefield. Servants moved through the corridors with lowered eyes, speaking in hushed tones, as if sound itself might worsen the king's condition. No royal herald announced the truth. No public proclamation acknowledged the severity of the crisis. England was being governed by a dying boy, yet the nation had no idea how close it stood to collapse. Inside Edward VII's chamber, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of medicines, sweat, and something far worse, the faint odor of decaying flesh. The once brilliant child whom Henry VIII had placed all his hopes in now lay in a half-lit room surrounded by tapestries meant to keep out the cold. The fire burned constantly, but it was never enough. Edward shivered even under layers of blankets, his frame so thin that the covers fell around him like empty cloth. Every few hours, attendants gently raised him so he could breathe with slightly less struggle. Each time Edward winced in pain, his bones, weakened by months of wasting disease, pressed sharply against his skin. Chroniclers noted that touching his shoulders felt like touching dry sticks beneath parchment. Physicians observed that any pressure left bruises instantly, a sign his blood was no longer clotting properly. The coughing became relentless. At first, It had been a violent fit once or twice an hour. Now it returned every few minutes, shaking his body until he gasped with desperation. Cushions were placed behind him to halt the force of his spasms, but they offered little comfort. Witnesses later wrote that the sound of the king's breathing was like air being pulled through water. His lungs were filling with fluid, and each breath clawed its way through a tightening chest. But the true horror emerged during one such fit in mid-April. As Edward struggled forward, a mixture of blood and thick mucus spilled onto his sheets. The attendants froze. This was more than a sign of tuberculosis. The substance had a dark, unusual color and a strong odor that suggested severe internal infection. The lungs of the young king were not only failing, they were breaking down, rotting from within. From this moment the council's panic intensified. The stability of England depended on Edward's life. Religious reform depended on his life. The future of the entire Tudor dynasty depended on his life. Yet each morning the physicians entered his chamber knowing he might not survive the day. Despite his agony, Edward attempted to continue governing. He asked for written reports, signing as long as his trembling hand allowed it. But the simple act of holding a quill exhausted him. His letters, once steady and elegant, became shaky, broken, nearly unreadable. His willpower remained, but his body was abandoning him. As April ended, something even more terrifying began to appear. Edward developed open sores along his back, arms, and chest, where his fragile skin broke apart under the weight of fever and constant sweating. These wounds refused to heal. Instead, they widened, leaking fluid that stained the sheets and filled the room with a metallic sourness that no herbs could mask. Tudor physicians lacked the knowledge to treat such systemic breakdown. They attempted poultices, oils, and heated plasters. Every treatment made his suffering worse. His fingernails loosened and fell away. His hair shed in clumps. His eyelids swelled so heavily he sometimes struggled to open them. When he did the once, bright blue eyes appeared cloudy, unfocused, as if the boy were slipping between consciousness and hallucination. By May 1553, external reports describe a monarch who looked decades older than his 15 years. The French ambassador reported seeing Edward only from a distance, but even then was horrified by the sight. He wrote that the king appeared as a pale shadow who seems already half spirit. Another observer remarked that Edward looked as though the life had drained from him, yet somehow his suffering kept him alive. What the public did not see was the emotional torment within those private chambers. Edward, though weakening, understood the danger his death posed. England had never before experienced the death of a minor king in such a politically divided climate. The young monarch had been raised in the Protestant faith. His half-sister Mary, next in the line of succession, was a devout Catholic who intended to reverse the nation's reforms. Their other sister, Elizabeth, although Protestant, still carried the legal stain of illegitimacy. Edward's ministers feared civil war, religious violence, and total political upheaval if either woman ascended the throne, so they pressured the dying king. Even as he coughed blood, even as he drifted in and out of painful delirium, advisers visited him to discuss succession. They needed him conscious, they needed his signature, they needed him to endorse a Protestant heir before it was too late. Edward, barely able to speak, croaked his agreement and began reviewing documents for what would later become known as the devise for the succession. His trembling fingers traced lines of text he could barely see. Every movement cost him precious energy. The attendants supporting him could feel his heart racing beneath his ribs, weak but panicked. The image of this moment is haunting. A dying boy, gasping for air, forcing himself to hold the quill so that England might avoid chaos after his death. It is one of the most tragic scenes in Tudor history, for it shows not a tyrant or a warrior king, but a child who understood he was running out of time. But even as Edward fought to preserve his reforms, His body was entering the most horrifying stage of its collapse. By late May, the lesions on his skin grew larger and darker. His breathing became so labored that attendants feared he might suffocate during the night. His voice faded entirely. Communication happened through weak gestures or brief, whispered words only those closest to him could interpret. His fever rose beyond anything the physicians had recorded before. The heat coming off his body was so intense that attendants kept basins of cool water nearby to soak cloths overnight. These were placed on his forehead and chest, but they dried within minutes. Edward's body was burning itself alive from within. The breakdown of his organs spread rapidly. His limbs swelled, then thinned again. His pulse became irregular, sometimes racing violently, sometimes slowing to frightening stillness. The boy king, once the hope of Henry VIII's dynasty, was now a living representation of fear, fragility, and political danger. Historians have long debated the precise cause of these symptoms. Some argue tuberculosis alone. Others suggest a co-infection such as measles or smallpox. But the descriptions from the time suggest something far deadlier, a systemic infection that triggered organ failure, tissue decay, and internal bleeding. Today, modern medical experts propose possible complications like septicemia or rare immune responses. Whatever the truth, it was far more gruesome than the sanitized versions found in traditional history books. By the beginning of June, Edward could no longer sit without assistance. His attendants lifted him like a fragile bundle of cloth. When they repositioned him, he cried out in pain. His skin tore open in new places. The sheets stuck to his wounds. Removing them caused bleeding. Yet through this nightmare, England continued to function outwardly as if nothing were wrong. Public appearances were cancelled with vague explanations. Government papers were issued in the king's name, though he could barely sign them. Ambassadors asked questions but received evasive replies. Silence and secrecy protected the truth. Inside the palace, however, there was no silence. Only the sound of a young king fighting for breath. Only the quiet weeping of attendants who knew there was nothing left to be done. Only the whispered fears of ministers who understood their future was tied to a boy who would not survive the summer. The horror of Edward's decline was now impossible to conceal. The final stage was approaching. By June 1553, the crisis inside the royal household was no longer something whispered about in corridors. It had become a suffocating presence that weighed on every person who stepped inside the palace. Servants avoided each other's eyes. Courtiers lingered near doors but refused to speak. The council members, normally proud and forceful, walked with dread carved into their faces. All of them believed the same thing but feared saying it aloud. The King of England was dying faster than anyone could manage the political explosion it would trigger. Yet if the palace felt heavy with fear, the king's bedchamber felt like another world entirely. The atmosphere was thick, warm, and humid from the fire that burned constantly. The shutters remained closed to keep drafts away, giving the room a dim, twilight appearance even in daylight. The smell of sickness had become so strong that attendants often left the room simply to breathe fresh air before returning, but no one dared stay away for long. Edward VI was only 15, but he was still the king, and this was still the Tudor court. By now, Edward's physical transformation shocked even those who had witnessed illness before. His face had become hollow, the cheeks sunken so deeply that his bones cast shadows across the skin. His lips cracked and bled. His eyes, once attentive and intelligent, lay half open, unfocused, as if the world around him was slipping away. He was so thin that when attendants lifted him, they could feel every rib, every vertebra, and every sharp corner of bone pressing through his fevered skin. The lesions on his body continued to spread. Some had fused into larger patches, raw and inflamed, leaking fluid that stained every cloth that touched them. Physicians tried washing the wounds, but water only brought pain and further tearing of his skin. Even light pressure caused bruising. His body had become a battlefield of infection and failing organs, The coughing, so violent in earlier months, had worsened to a level almost unimaginable. When a fit came, Edward's entire body convulsed. His spine arched, his thin arms shook uncontrollably. Blood mixed with mucus spilled from his mouth and nose. Each episode left him gasping for air as attendants rushed to wipe his face and support his weight. Some physicians believed that portions of his lung tissue were breaking apart, explaining the thick, dark substance he expelled. By mid-June, Edward could no longer eat. Every attempt caused him to choke. Thin broth dripped from the corner of his lips as his body rejected even the mildest nourishment. His attendants soaked cloths with water and touched them to his mouth, but he could not swallow. His body, once fragile but functional, was now shutting down entirely. At the same time, the political tension in the palace escalated to a dangerous level. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, understood the stakes better than anyone. If Mary Tudor became queen, his influence would end. Worse, many of those who supported the Protestant reforms would lose everything. Edward's slow, agonizing decline gave them time to plan, but time was also their enemy. They needed the king conscious long enough to finish the device for the succession. Northumberland visited the royal chambers often, standing at the foot of the bed, studying the dying boy with the eyes of a man calculating a future slipping through his fingers. Edward's labored breathing filled the room, but politics could not pause for compassion. The fate of the kingdom hung on whether this frail teenager could survive a little longer. In these moments, Edward demonstrated extraordinary will. Though nearly unable to speak, he motioned for writing materials. Attendants brought a board, ink, and quill. They held his hand steady as he traced his weakened signature. The device for the succession, naming Lady Jane Grey as his heir, became the final political work of his life. Each time he lifted the quill, his fingers trembled violently, but the boy was determined. Even dying, he believed he was protecting England from reverting to Catholic rule. It was a tragic image, a child, king, barely recognizable, struggling to write laws he would not live to see enforced. Meanwhile, the disease ravaging him moved into its most horrifying stage. Physicians noted that Edward's skin had begun to peel in places, particularly along his arms and torso. Fever had pushed his body into extreme dehydration, causing the skin to crack. Every movement tore it further. His attendants applied salves to soften the tissue, but these only offered brief relief. Beneath the cracked skin, new sores appeared, oozing fluid. The swelling in his limbs became unpredictable. Sometimes his legs appeared as thin as sticks. Other times they swelled dramatically due to failing circulation and infection. His feet, once delicate and princely, turned dark in places, as though starved of blood. It is believed today that Edward may have suffered from sepsis spreading through his bloodstream, slowly poisoning every organ. His breathing grew so shallow that attendants had to lean close to confirm he was alive. Sometimes his chest hardly moved. Other times he gasped loudly, as if finally breaking the surface of deep water. His nights were filled with delirium. He called for his mother, Jane Seymour. He called for God. He murmured fragments of prayers, his voice too faint to understand. Once he begged for the pain to stop, his voice cracking like thin glass. By late June, the council understood that Edward could die at any moment. Northumberland worked frantically to secure the support of key nobles for Lady Jane Grey's succession. But a terrible irony lingered over these efforts. The longer Edward lingered in agony, the more time conspirators had to prepare. Yet each additional day of life was also an additional day of unbearable suffering for the boy himself. Witnesses later wrote that Edward's chamber felt like a place where time had slowed. The curtains remained drawn. The fire crackled softly, sometimes the only sound beside the king's labored breathing. Attendants moved quietly, afraid even the rustle of their clothing might disturb him. Some wept softly at the sight of his suffering. Others prayed in the corners of the room. No one could stop what was happening. On June 30 a severe coughing fit shook Edward's body so violently that a physician feared his ribs might collapse. Blood spilled across his gown. Edward tried to speak afterward, but no words came out. His voice had abandoned him completely. He looked at his attendants with wide, terrified eyes. It was clear he understood that death was near. In the last days of June and first days of July, Edward's decline accelerated sharply. He slipped in and out of consciousness. His skin turned cold, mottled with dark patches. His pulse raced for minutes, then grew faint. His throat produced a rattling sound with each breath. His body trembled with chills, even as his fever soared. On the morning of July 5, Edward opened his eyes one final time. An attendant recorded that he attempted to sit up, but his body had no strength left. He fell back with a soft cry. That afternoon he slipped into a deep, unresponsive state. The shadows in the chamber lengthened. The air grew heavy. The moment everyone had feared was coming. England's young king, the one hope Henry VIII had fought so desperately to produce, was about to take his final breath. On the evening of July 6, 1553, the atmosphere inside Edward VI's chamber resembled that of a vigil more than a royal bedroom. The fire was kept low, casting soft light that flickered across the walls. The smell of medicines, sweat, and infection clung to every tapestry. The young king lay motionless, his frail chest rising only slightly with each breath. The sound of his breathing had changed. It was now the unmistakable rattle of a body in its final hours. Physicians stood silently at the edge of the room, their faces grim. They had done everything Tudor medicine allowed, but Edward's body had reached the point of no return. His organs were failing, his lungs were collapsing, his heart struggled with every pulse. The skin on his face had turned pale with a bluish tint, a sign that oxygen was no longer circulating properly. His lips were cracked and dry, his eyelids fluttered occasionally, but he no longer responded to voices. A few attendants remained beside him, men who had served him since childhood. Some whispered prayers. Others simply watched, hearts heavy with grief. This was not a king dying with dignity and peace. This was a child expiring under the crushing weight of disease, political pressure, and a legacy he had never asked for. Shortly before sunset, a violent coughing fit shook Edward's body. For several seconds, attendants feared he might choke. Blood and fluid spilled from his mouth. His body arched slightly, then went still. For a terrifying moment it seemed he was gone, but a faint breath followed, then another, then a long pause. Minutes stretched like hours. Each breath became slower and weaker, as though the dying boy was being pulled further from the world. Outside the closed doors, a few members of the Privy Council waited anxiously. No one dared leave the palace. The fate of England depended on what happened in this room. Sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock that night, Edward's breathing changed once more. It became soft, shallow, barely audible. An attendant leaned close, straining to hear him. Edward whispered something nearly impossible to understand. Those present later insisted he said, "Lord, receive my spirit," repeating the final words spoken by the first Christian martyr in Scripture. Whether those were the real words or a comforting reconstruction, the moment left a deep impression. At last, with a final exhale that seemed more like a sigh, the breath stopped. Silence filled the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The flame in the hearth crackled softly, the only sound in a chamber that had witnessed months of suffering. A physician stepped forward, placed 2 fingers on the king's wrist, and waited. No pulse. He then touched Edward's neck. Nothing. England's boy, king, was dead. The attendants lowered their heads. Some wept quietly. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. For all the political maneuvering, religious upheaval, and dynastic ambition that had shaped Edward's short life, he died not as a monarch commanding armies or issuing decrees, but as a sick, fragile child whose final months had been an unending nightmare. Outside the chamber, the Privy Council absorbed the news with mixed shock and dread. For some, it meant the collapse of their political futures. For others, it meant the beginning of violent uncertainty. England was without a king, and the rightful heir, Mary Tudor, was Catholic in a newly Protestant kingdom. Northumberland moved swiftly. According to Edward's devise for the succession, Lady Jane Grey would now take the throne. The council made preparations to announce her as queen, but the truth was already spreading through whispers. The king was dead, and England had been plunged into a succession crisis. The tragedy of Edward VI's death went far beyond the personal suffering he endured. It set into motion one of the most turbulent transitions in English history. While the palace scrambled to hide the king's corpse and manage the narrative of a peaceful passing, inquiries began circulating through London. Rumours spread like wildfire. Many citizens believed the king had been poisoned. Others thought he had been cursed. Few people accepted illness as the cause, because no one outside the palace understood how horrifying and prolonged the disease had been. In reality, the symptoms Edward suffered align with modern interpretations of a complex, multi-system infection. Though tuberculosis certainly played a role, historians and medical experts now suspect complications such as chronic sepsis, viral infections, and immune collapse. His lesions, decaying lung tissue, organ failure, and extreme wasting paint a far darker picture than the sanitized historical accounts once suggested. But the political aftermath was just as brutal as his illness. On July 10, Lady Jane Grey was declared queen. Though intelligent and devout, she had never sought the throne. She was a pawn in a political struggle engineered by Northumberland. Edward's death had left the kingdom in a fragile state, and the attempt to bypass Mary only worsened the instability. Within days, public support swung overwhelmingly toward Mary, the true heir under Henry VIII's own succession laws. Citizens marched in her favour, nobles abandoned Northumberland, the government collapsed into disarray. On July 19, Mary entered London as queen, greeted by thousands. Jane Grey's reign ended after 9 days. Northumberland was arrested and later executed. Jane herself, innocent but politically dangerous, was executed the following February. Edward's death had not only ended the Tudor male line, but had also triggered a wave of executions, religious reversals, and political chaos. Mary returned England to Catholicism, undoing many of Edward's reforms. Protestants fled or hid. The burning of heretics during Mary's reign earned her the infamous title Bloody Mary, a legacy intertwined indirectly with Edward's demise. Elizabeth, years later, would restore Protestantism and give England the stability it desperately needed. But even she never fully escaped the shadow of the tragedy that struck her younger brother. In the centuries that followed, historians softened the details of Edward's death. They attributed it to simple consumption, a polite word for tuberculosis, but the private accounts, ambassadorial letters, and preserved medical descriptions reveal something far more terrifying. Edward did not slip away quietly. He endured one of the most horrifying royal deaths ever documented, a slow destruction of his body that Tudor chroniclers avoided describing out of shock and respect. He was a king, but he was also a child. And the truth of his death reflects not the strength of his crown, but the cruelty of disease and the brutal weight of Tudor politics. Edward VI died before he could fulfill any of the promises his education, intelligence, and idealism had suggested. His reign lasted just over 6 years. His legacy, though often overshadowed by Mary and Elizabeth, remains one of the most tragic chapters in Tudor history. For in the end, the heir Henry VIII had sacrificed everything to obtain died in a manner far more horrifying than history ever dared to tell.